Before I turn it over to Caleb, I want to make sure that I say that this webinar series is largely funded and supported by Northeast SARE, who has awarded a research and education grant to UMass with Masuta Shemi, UVM with Heather Darby, and UMaine with Rick Kirstbergen. And they have a project going on over the next couple of years to continue to study forms of alternative grazing, things like stockpiling, grazing annuals, grazing your winter cover crops, all the things that we're covering in this webinar series. So hopefully there's going to be some new exciting data coming out of the pipeline as well. I also want to make sure to say thank you to the Livestock Institute, who's funded by the Cedar Tree grant as a part of the New England Grazing Network, and they're providing administrative support for the series today as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb here in just a second. Caleb received his PhD recently from the University of Vermont. While he was there, he did do some research on annuals, which he's going to share some of that with us today. And now he is currently with the Maine Organic Farmer and Gardener Association, where he is an organic crop and conservation specialist. So Caleb, thank you so much for being here with us today. And now I am going to go ahead and turn the show over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Sam. All right. Start this up. Does that look good to everybody? Okay.
Looks good, sounds good.
All right. So, yeah, I did my PhD at UVM, and that's where this is coming from, hence the UVM logo there. But I'm now at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. So if you need to get in touch with me, if you have any questions, that's where you're going to find me. So this is some results of actually a SARE project that I did at the Choiniere family farm in northern Vermont. And they're an organic grass-based dairy. They're entirely grass-fed. And so some of this was just kind of playing with the practices they're already utilizing. And some of this presentation was actually prepared by Matt Choiniere. So you'll get to hear right from the farmer's mouth themselves, just through me. Matt and Guy are a son and father that run this whole dairy. But first, I just want to go over the basics. If you're going to get into summer annuals, you need to know there are some specific risks. The first being nitrate toxicity, and you need a lot of nitrate in the plant for it to be a problem, but it is a potential. And prussic acid poisoning, which is really cyanide that the plant makes itself. And any of the sorghum or sudangrass or hybrids in between them can contain prussic acid. Pearl millet won't. So that's one reason why pearl millet can be nice as a choice. And to avoid both these problems, you don't want to graze the plants until they're at least 18 inches tall. The pearl millet, you could actually be a little shorter because it's not quite as tall of a plant. You're going to want to avoid excessive fertilization, which I know is not super common, especially, but if it was a field that was getting a lot of manure, you might want to think about it and just really pencil it out. How much nitrogen is really going on that field and how much is going to be available to the plants. If there's been a drought, a really dry period, and then you get a fresh rain, that's when the plant can actually take up a lot of nitrate. And so that's when it's a higher risk. So in that situation, you'd want to wait a while before you start grazing it again. And specifically for the prussic acid, you don't want to graze wilted plants or plants that have really young tillers, because it's that young regrowth or that young new growth that's going to have more of the prussic acid. If there's a light frost, you're not going to want to graze. You're going to want to see where things shake out after a few days' time, but there's a good chance that strongly increases the prussic acid content. And if there's a killing frost, you can wait until the plant, a couple days later, and the prussic acid will dissipate, and you'll have standing dead forage that you can graze. But really, with these summer annuals, by the time you're getting into frost, they're not nearly as productive, and it's probably a better idea to have been moving on already, at least here in northern New England. And I think probably that's the case for southern New England as well. If you make silage with summer annuals, you're going to want to wait about 2 months before feeding it out. And again, that's for prussic acid to make sure it's dissipated and not going to be a problem. And that's probably a conservative estimate, the 2 months. It may be less time, but better safe than sorry. So why would we grow summer annuals? One reason a lot of folks do is as a rescue planting. Say their corn planting didn't go as planned, and that field's really looking terrible. Maybe you're doing a pasture renovation, and so it's a nice way to break down that sod, hopefully get some perennial weeds out of the mix, choke them out with a strong summer annual stand is the hope. And then the more common is to provide supplemental summer grazing when our cool season pastures are in their summer slump. And the reason is that cool season plants are, I should clarify that when I say summer annuals, there are cool season plants that you can grow as annuals throughout the summer, right? Like you could plant peas and oats right now, and those would be annuals, and they'd be growing in the summer. But when we talk about summer annuals, we're really referring to specific plants that actually have a slightly different type of photosynthesis, which makes them really efficient in their use of water. So they can take hot, dry temperatures. So a cool season plant, like our perennial pasture lands, they do the best in the spring, right about now, and then into the fall when temperatures are cooler and there's usually more moisture availability. Some of the season extension that is going to be talked about in the series would be maybe using cereal grains, possibly for fall grazing, but often for that first spring grazing. Brassicas make a nice fall one. Other people do use brassicas through the summer, but with varying degrees of satisfaction or success. It depends on what brassica and depends on their system and their setup, and honestly, when they do their seeding. And then this is where we want those warm season grasses for that slump in our warmest middle of the summer months, because that's when our cool season plants are less productive, but our warm season plants are, that's when they're at their best. So let's see, right. So if say you're sold, you want to try it out, what do you need to worry about for your seeding conditions? You're going to need a clean seed bed. They're not going to compete well with pasture. I have seen some folks try interplanting summer annuals in pasture. The one display I saw, I wasn't super impressed. I'm sure there's probably some ways it can work, but they grow sort of like corn, and they're going to want a little bit of space and not too much competition when they first get started, because they have that different photosynthesis. They've really evolved to do best in warm, dry conditions, which means if you try to plant them out too early when the soil's still cold, it's going to be miserable. You're not going to be happy. So you should really wait for the soil temperature to warm up. In northern New England, that's often early June. Maybe in Connecticut, you can be getting away in May sometime, but really look at the soil temperature. For the most part, these plants don't tolerate frosts, so you don't want to do it before your last frost. And you're going to want good seed to soil contact. I mean, that's true for pretty much any seeding, but it's really important with the smaller seeded summer annuals. And I don't go through every summer annual. The most common are probably sorghums, Sudan grasses, and then hybrids of sorghum and Sudan grass, millets like pearl millet and Japanese millet. And then there's some less common ones like teff, which is a much smaller plant. And I'm not going to get into depth with that one. And teff, but it is one of the very small seeded ones. Pearl millet is a fairly small seed, and then the Sudan grasses and sorghums are much larger seeds. And that's also going to relate to how deep you're going to want to plant, right? So teff, you would want to be really just on the soil surface. Pearl millet could be about ½ an inch deep, up to 3/4 of an inch if your soil is light textured. But if you have a heavy soil, I wouldn't go that deep. And then the sorghums and Sudans, they can go below an inch deep. And you know, it's basically based on the seed size, how much energy they have to send their seedling up through the soil. And that's going to play a little bit into moisture as well, right? So in a spring like this, it's going to be a little tricky to do a small seeded one because you can't plant it as deep, and that top layer of soil is going to dry out a little faster. So maybe if you were trying to decide right now, you might want to go for a larger seeded one, like a sudangrass or a sorghum. And then in general, summer annuals need nitrogen. Don't worry too much about the rates there at the bottom. That was at a very, very, very sandy site with few nitrogen credits, right? It didn't have too much organic matter. Manure had not been applied. This was a research plot. That's why the rates are really getting pretty high there. But it shows that, you know, we're looking at the lowest rate, 35 pounds of nitrogen per acre, of just a, you know, 750 pounds per acre, to the highest rate. And this is at a haylage maturity, so a little taller than you want to graze, but for the point here, 2,500 pounds per acre. And this is from one cutting. So, you know, a second cutting would hopefully double that. It's going to depend on the year and what you're growing. And this was an example of just pearl millet and sudangrass. And this, I think, is probably more convincing to you, right? So here's the low rate and the high rate. And like I said earlier, with the nitrate concerns, you're not going to want to go really excessive, but you need to make sure you have enough. Because if you're really just skimping by, you seed it and you don't supply enough nitrogen, there's not enough manure, there's not enough nitrogen credits from your organic matter, you're going to end up with a stand at the left. Look how weedy that is. That's not going to control anything. I think you can even see some milkweed shooting up right there. Whereas that stand on the right, you can already see the difference in yield, both in density as well as height. And you can see how leafy and, you know, it looks like a richer set of forage and grazing right in there. So this is the Choiniere family farm. And they, at this time, this was a couple years ago when this presentation, these slides were put together, but they had about 80 cows, 30 replacements. They were doing 450 acres all grass. I mean, it's about a total of 420. And 12 of those were annual forages, right? So they weren't replacing their entire setup. They were using this as a supplemental feeding. And here's a picture of their bedded pack that they've been really happy with ever since they put it up. And then from their own words, why do they graze annuals? Midsummer, you know, the cows get hot and they don't do as much. So in the middle of the day in the pasture, you know, they're just kind of languishing. They're hot. They feel they're not really feeling hungry. They cluster together and they can kill pasture spots. So the Choinieres wanted to get them eating again, hoping that that'll, you know, increase their entire dry matter intake. They feel like they're getting more yield in the heat of the summer when their pastures maybe aren't growing as fast. So then there's a little more that they still got going in these fields that they do put into annuals. And then they're also using it as soil building. Guy is a big fan of soil health, and so he's very happy to feed his worms as much as he is to feed his cows, because he feels like that's going to feed his cows down the line. And that you can get some high energy out of these crops if they're managed well. At least that's what Guy feels. He felt like he was getting some milk out of these. And just, yeah, getting up through the hot summer months when it's in a hot, dry year, he's very happy to have them. In the cool, dry year, well, you have them still, even if they weren't as important. Or sorry, a cool, wet year. Here's an overview of this field that they would put into annuals. They'd break it up into paddocks, and then actually they will graze out and cross rope, you know, put strands across it and make little blocks to maximize the grazing efficiency. And they'll bring the cows in for milking and put them out into these paddocks to get them eating again. So the annuals they like to use, peas and oats, those are cool season, so I won't really be getting into that. Raise crazy mix that has a mix of cool season and warm season plants, really kooky stuff into like sunflowers and all sorts of things. I'm not sold on the mix yet, but the nice thing about the mix is that at least something will take hold. So say you had a bad year for one crop, there's going to be something in the mix that's going to do okay. They've also experimented with turnip and Japanese millet together, Sudan grass straight, Italian ryegrass. That's another one where it's typically going to be an annual, but it is a cool season. So it's sort of an in-between with our cool season pasture and our warm season annuals. It's going to behave a little differently, and it's sort of its own thing. So I'm not getting into that today. And then they wanted to note that turnips and Italian ryegrass, and again, those are cool season plants, but they withstood the trampling the best. That's been their experience. And they always seed a little heavier to make sure they have a really thick stand. I think Guy feels like it's a cheap insurance. He'd rather pay for a little bit extra seed. So here's a picture of one of their crazy mixes, and this is partially why I'm not super psyched on it. If you look there, you see it's almost all brassicas that made it through in this particular growing season. You don't see many grasses that made it through. I don't even see the sunflowers, but of course, throughout the field, they had different things going on. Turnip and Japanese millet, when they do this mix, they find the turnips and the radishes. If you don't know what the weather is going to be, right? Like you can only know so far out. If it turns cool and wet, then you still at least have these cool season annuals coming through. But if it's warm and dry, like you're prepared for, I should also mention that field of Guise is very sandy. It drains very well, so it gets pretty dry. That's when the millet will catch well, and it'll save your bacon if it's too hot and too dry. They've tried Wonderleaf pearl millet, but they are preferring the Japanese millet, at least at the time of making this slide. And then for their Sudan grass, they like how fast it can grow. They feel like they can get a graze onto it about a month later. It's a good option if you end up planting late. So they can have their cows out grazing in May and June, and then come July, they're ready to go right into the Sudan grass. And if one of your fields of annuals, because Guy likes to have that smorgasbord, he likes to have a whole mix of different strips of different annual mixes. If one of them doesn't work out, he might come back through with Sudan grass just because it's fairly quick growing and it can come in as his rescue option. And then he also is using the Italian ryegrass as the base of most of his mixes because it grows quickly and it'll thicken the stand. It'll kind of stay in the undergrowth. And he feels it can be high energy and you can get a lot of milk out of it, as well as as I mentioned before, the withstanding trampling. And this is their general scheme for their annual forages. June 1 is their planting date. And again, they're very much northern Vermont, close to the Canadian border. So adjust for your own conditions. I'm sure several folks here from warmer areas that they can maybe get out a little earlier. And then they're grazing by the 1st of July, ideally anyway. And they try to get 3 rounds on each paddock that they fence off. And done grazing by September, they're back on to just perennial pasture, although they are using perennial pasture throughout, I should mention. And then they will also seed these same paddocks over to winter rye for fall grazing, and then one more grazing in the spring up until they turn the field back over to their summer annuals. And last bits from the Choinières, this is the way they seed. It's putting it on a power harrow there, and they just sort of had a custom combination where they put an air seeder on their power harrow. And some nice shots. You can see the spreader plates down at the bottom, right before the roller bar. So the harrow's working up the soil, they're dropping the seed, and then the roller bar is incorporating and packing it down just a little bit, give it some good seed to soil contact so the seeds can take up water well. And this was still relatively new when I was talking with Guy about it, and he was very, very happy with this sort of combination, putting the two together. He loved being able to do it in one pass. But if you don't, clearly not everyone's going to have this setup. If you are seeding, if you have a Brillion or a Cultipacker, or maybe you just have a roller on another piece of equipment that you can run the equipment disengaged so that the roller is packing the soil a little bit, something to get good seed to soil contact. Some things to consider. I forgot, this is also some notes from the Choinières. They always use back fences to let the grazed sections regrow, because remember, they're grazing them 3 different times. They try to get everybody into a smaller paddock to reduce trampling. It was still an issue, you'll see from some of my photos in a minute. And then you have to provide enough time for that paddock to regrow before you want to graze it again. One thing that they've learned over the years is to plant in 2 different sessions, so that the tail end of the first session, if you did it all at once, by the time you got to that last paddock, the plants are going to be pretty mature, pretty leggy, and pretty stemmy. And that's what the next part of my presentation is going to be about. And Guy kind of sums that up as palatability versus maturity versus yield. You know, the bigger it is, the more yield, but how palatable is it? How digestible is that fiber? And then how many years in a row are you going to plant annuals in the same field? And by the time we were doing this study at Guy's, he had been doing it for quite a few years, and the weed pressure, it was a cold spring. The summer annuals didn't jump, and the weeds did. So there was a fair amount of weed pressure. Here's a picture of Guy's paddocks in action. You can see pretty clearly what's been grazed, what hasn't, and what's been grazed most recently. You can see right here, been well trampled. But in the foreground, that's about the height you're hoping they graze down to. You don't want them to graze down more than like 6 inches on these summer annuals. These summer annuals store a lot more of their reserve energy above ground, higher up, and they have a higher growing point than our perennial pastures. So if they were grazed as low as your pasture maybe can withstand, your regrowth is going to suffer. And then you can also see the size of the paddock and how tight the cows are in there. And that's, Guy feels, is important for his management system to get them to utilize it the best. And this can really show how Pro Millet can jump. So there's July 18th on the left. And that's where you want to start grazing. It's over 18 inches. Look how leafy that is. Looks like pretty high quality. And then on the right, you can see that they don't even have to bend over, which is convenient to graze those leaves. But that's what they're going for. They're going for the leaves at the top of the plant. But because the stem's elongated, you actually have, the leaves are less dense, right? When the stems are shorter, where the leaf branches off the rest of the plant is a lot closer together. So one bite, you can get a lot more leaf tissue. And that's really what's happening, is the cows are selecting what they want. And that's his neighbor's corn in the background, just in case you're wondering. So here's another shot from another study I was doing on sudangrass. And this just shows when it's elongated, here's 5 individual tillers, that much sort of pseudo stem material, and then that much leaf material. Nice big leaves, and all in all, you put the 2 together, you're getting a fair amount of dry matter over a field, but a lot of that becomes stem. And that's where my questions came in for this study of looking at that grazing selection and what's the quality versus the yield. Where's that trade-off coming in? So here's another shot where you can see are pretty well trampled on the left. Coming in on the right, there's the raised crazy mix in the back. It's already gone all to seed, all to flower, which is one reason why I don't know that I would want to use it in the summer. I don't know that I want to plant it in June, because the brassicas are going to get triggered to flower, and they're going to bolt. But you can see here near the edge of the paddock, look how much less trampling there is, and that's really what your ideal is. You want your stand to look like that after they're done grazing. Oh, too far. And another shot of the same situation. You can see the regrowth is going to be a bit hindered. Some of these tillers have straight up just been pulled out of the ground. And that got worse and worse as the planting went on. So this is breaking it up in leaf matter and pseudostem, which is, the actual, the flowering part that's going to come up, the comb, as well as the petiole and the sheath, basically the leaf sheath. So when you start off that first day of grazing, they're getting pretty much all leaf tissue, all leaf matter. And then as you continue, the stem starts to elongate. and you're getting more and more of that pseudostem tissue, but the overall increase in dry matter yield over that acreage, after that fourth day they went out into the grazing, you were pretty much already getting your maximum leaf dry matter intake that you would see out of the entire planting. All the increases in dry matter yield pretty much came from the pseudostem as the plant was elongating. And so that's going to be more fibrous, a little lower quality. So this graph's a little confusing. If you just look at the leaf tissue, that's the green line, the green dots over those same days of grazing, you can see, and sorry, this is milk, which is kind of a made up unit where it's calculated based on the yield as well as the quality of the forage. So if you were to only somehow feed them the leaves, they would be producing, this is why it's kind of a made up unit. We're going to pretend they're producing 2,000 kilograms of milk per hectare, which actually shakes out to roughly like a ton per acre. And you can see as it grows, you're getting some increases with yield and some of the quality parameters in the leaf, but it stays pretty much the same. And then if we look at just the pseudostem, which is the red, there was hardly any at the beginning, and you see that increase at the end, and that's mostly because of yield, because that's that big increase in dry matter and how much would actually be eaten. And if you average the two, you see your entire plant. So our sweet spot seems to be, yeah, you'd like the idea that you're getting that big amount of milk off of every acre at the end because of that high yield, but that's the way this factor is calculated. It's taking in that dry matter part of the equation. If we look at the same measurement of milk, but we were basing it just on tons of forage, you can see that pound for pound, the forage actually just continues to decrease a little bit. So your leaf matter is giving you the most milk, the most energy for milk production. The stem drops off pretty quickly. A couple weeks of grazing, you're down at pound for pound of grazing that they're doing. They're not actually producing as much a couple weeks into the grazing as they were when it first started. And then if you average it out over the entire plant, you can see it's not nearly as bad because those leaves are maintaining that higher quality. To look at it just in terms of NDF, the pearl millet, everything in green from here on out is going to be leaf tissue, and the brown is the pseudostem tissue. So as the plants got taller, your NDF does creep up in your leaf tissue, but it already started higher in your pseudostem tissue and went up a lot higher. And your digestibility goes down, but you can see that in the leaf tissue, it's already, you're going from low to mid 70s to high 60s to mid 60s. You're already starting out around the 70% range for NDF digestibility, down to about the 60% range. And since we're running up on time here a little bit, want to save time for questions, I wanted to highlight that Heather Darby at her website, uvm.edu/extension/Northwest Crops and WCrops/research, has a lot of research reports from many years. And the past couple years for her summer annuals, she's done some great variety trials. And you can see this is a graph of total dry matter yield based against relative forage quality. So if you are considering some of these summer annuals and you want to look at that basic, the whole plant quality versus yield, where is that trade-off? This is a nice way to look at it. And you can see that as your forage feed value goes up, the yield tends to go down. So you kind of want that sweet spot of high yield and quality. And with that, I want to thank the Choiniere family and SARE for helping to fund that little bit of research. And I think we can get into questions. I guess I should also say that my take home from this was, yeah, 2 successions, maybe 3 successions. If you're going to do staggered grazing of these summer annuals, you can see if it's primarily for grazing, you really want to get that quality, and that your yield increases are they'll be there, but I don't know that the cows are even going to take them in. It's not as palatable. They were leaving those stems behind, and that meant poor regrowth in that later maturity. So by the end of that experiment, Guy was pretty set on, yeah, I'm going to do a couple.
So I'm not sure if anybody else is having this problem, but right now it looks like Caleb's audio cut out. So I am going to try to fix that. Caleb, it looks like you are self-muted.
Oh,
There you
it
go.
wouldn't let me turn it off.
Oh,
But then it did. I have no idea why.
sorry.
That's okay. I was pretty much wrapping up. I was starting to ramble there. So I'd love to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, you do have a couple of questions. I'll be honest, it might have been my fault. I was trying to unmute the audience members and I might have hit the wrong button. But so now, audience members, I believe I have unmuted all of you. So if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, you have that ability. If you don't have that ability, please type in your question. But Caleb, you do have a couple of questions. One, I'm gonna get back to that panel. I'll ask you the easy one first. One is from Rick. He was wondering what the white flower is in Ray's Crazy Mix.
Yeah, I don't remember. That was either a radish, like a daikon radish, a tillage radish, same species, or it was a turnip. Although I think my memory is that was probably a daikon radish. And so the issue with radishes in particular, those biennials are triggered to flower by the long midday summer. And so basically they got planted in early June, and then, you know, midday summer, they were like, oh man, I must have, it's time to flower, we're running out of time. And so they shoot up those flower heads. If you plant them later, like in later July, then they're a lot less likely to do that. And then I should say the summer annuals, some of them are also triggered by decreasing daylight. So in some of my studies, when I had pearl millet going, by the end of the time, you know, I get to the third cutting, because I was cutting because it was a research project. We weren't actually grazing them. The regrowth would just immediately head up because it was the day length was triggering it and saying like, winter's coming, you got to set seed if you're going to do it. So that's another reason why, as we're heading towards fall, the summer annuals really, you know, you got to learn to say goodbye.
Definitely, yeah. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. This one is from Christine. The question is, in what setup or scenarios would annuals be most beneficial? If we have good recovering pasture, and that is most of our open area, the rest is forested, would it be worth considering?
I would say if your pasture has been, it depends on your situation. I don't know that I'm going to punt a little bit. I don't want to steer you wrong. I don't want to I don't want to oversell it. I would say if you want to look into it, start small, you know, start with one smaller area and see how it went, and learn some of your lessons there, because it's, you know, pasture's a little forgiving, right? Because you had it last year. There's only so much it's going to go downhill. But if you tear it up and plant an annual crop, if you mess it up, that's a bigger risk. So start small, learn how to manage it, and think about how it's going. But really, it's when you take a look at your pastures and you see that they're just sitting in the middle of summer and they're not producing what you need, or if you get to the point where you have to feed out too much stored forage in the middle of the summer, that's when you might want to think of like, how could I get more grazing going in the summer? It's particularly an issue for these grass-based farms where they're not going to be supplementing with grain.
Definitely, yeah, that's a question we get a lot, or I see a lot on these annual presentations, is where does it fit? And so I'll follow up on that, and then I'll move to the other questions with It sounds like Guy always allocates space in his rotation, and he has one section that is in a constant annual rotation. Is that correct?
That was Guy's system. I haven't checked in the past year or so, so I don't know. He may have modified it by now. He is a bit of a tinkerer, always improving. But I do remember he was hoping to switch over to a different field because he was getting a fair amount of pigweed coming up in that one. So he was going
Got
to
it.
put it down to something a little longer term.
Got it. So here's another question, and I'll preface this. This is from Laura, and I'll preface this by saying that, Laura, you're going to want to tune into Rick's presentation next month. But Caleb, the question is, what about no-till interseeding summer annuals into perennial cool season pasture? Is this a thing that folks do?
It's definitely something people have done. And I'm going to say that I've only seen it once, and I wasn't super impressed, but the pasture wasn't really set back. And the no-till planting, it didn't give much of a strip for the warm season annuals to get in. So they were basically just outcompeted by the pasture in the early spring. I imagine more folks out there, hopefully Rick can fill us in with some better ways it's been done.
And let's see, here's one from Jacqueline, and I think this is again a good question for you, Caleb, and a good plug for Rick. You guys are making my job easy. What are your no plow options? I'm small scale. They follow up to say, this is my first year and I'm concerned that there will not be anything in August.
Okay, so what are the no plow options?
Yeah, what are no plow options if they're small scale? And they follow up by saying they're a little concerned. This is their first year. I'm assuming first year grazing, maybe. Please correct me if I'm interpreting wrong. And there's a concern that they're not going to have anything to graze come August.
Yeah, it's going to be really tricky to get these in. I mean, I don't have too much familiar with no-till, at least for forages. So if you could plant it like corn and it was a larger seeded one, you'd probably be okay in a no-till system, but you'd need to really burn down whatever was before there. It's the competition, as you know, any small seedling is not going to tolerate much competition from an established pasture or hayfield. So it's going to be, that's a tricky one. I don't know if there's a great way for no-till to work there.
Yeah, and they do follow up and say they have 10 years of experience, but it's a new farm. Yeah, that is a tricky one. I'll put this out and they can follow up, and if I see a response, we can jump back to it. Caleb, what are your thoughts on herbicide?
Well, I work for the Maine Organic.
Oh, that's right.
That?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, I work for the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. So I'm open to all sorts of different approaches. I like every way that folks are farming, but the farmers that I work with are organic, so we don't really use herbicides. So for the most part, I just don't have much familiarity.
Right. Okay. And they did follow up and they said organic preferred. I know it's probably a little wonky for everybody because I can see the questions and you can't. But I do see the question askers as they're providing more context.
Oh, so organic herbicides.
Well, organic management is preferred.
Yeah.
So if
I see, as their operation. Yeah, because there are organic herbicides, although I have yet to be to see a demonstration that impresses me.
Right. Great. Well, we'll have to tune in, and we'll put it on Rick next month to give us some thoughts on that. So here's another question. From an animal perspective, did geese see any issues with forage intake, milk production, or MUN values when crowding cows to prevent trampling?
I don't know about the MUN values. I am more on the plant side of things than the livestock side of things. And I don't know that he could say whether or not, first of all, I shouldn't speak too much for Guy, right? But I didn't get the impression that there was a noticeable difference based on the crowding versus just the overall conditions of his perennial pasture and getting them on annuals so that they were getting more intake in. I mean, that was his whole motivation, was get them out onto these annuals. It's almost just for a change of scenery, get them a little excited about eating something different. And he felt like that helped get the dry matter intake, helped keep it up during the summer and helped keep the milk flowing. Guy was
This is Rick.
producing,
And I'm going to add to that a little bit, and it's Caleb's exactly right. They used it as a stimulant to increase dry matter intake. So basically they used it for short duration grazing after they may have grazed the cool season perennials for a while. They'd shift them to these warm season annuals to try and stimulate intake. That was the whole idea behind some of this.
And for context, for those that aren't familiar, that was Rick Hertzberg, he is at UMaine, one of the grant collaborators, and he knows quite a bit about these topics. So I'll follow up on that as well and say that this is a question that comes up quite a bit, and a lot of us, as Caleb said, are on the plant side of things as agronomists or plant scientists. So we are working on scheduling. It's still tentative, but we are planning to have an animal specialist, an animal scientist, do one of our webinars later on this year to talk specifically about some of those intake quality performance questions for both milk production or weight gain, meat quality when feeding these different annuals. And let's see, we had a comment come in from Jen Colby. Crowding is a little bit of a misnomer. It creates competitiveness, but the short duration does not cause negative effects. A little more context there. So we are just about at time. If there are any other questions, we have time for maybe one more. But if not, then I will say thank you very much to everyone for being here. Caleb, thank you so much for presenting today. And please stay tuned for those upcoming webinars. Again, we're doing them right now on the last Friday of every month through August, and we will be scheduling that forage quality one, as I mentioned. And Trey Bishop has offered to do one on stockpiling sometime in August. We'll just pin down that date. Obviously, he's a farmer as well, so things are a little hairy pinning down something in August. But thanks again, everyone. And if you have any questions, any follow-up, please send me an email and I can put you in touch with the right person.